Pull out your hose and grab your can. We're about to integrate another Pest Geek podcast. Hi, everybody. Frank Hernandez here, and welcome to the Pest Geek podcast, bringing you the latest information on pests, products, and politics from today's leading industry sources to help you start, manage, and grow your pest control business.
Hey, welcome back. Welcome back to another edition of the Pest Geek podcast. I am Frank Hernandez, your Pest Geek, here discussing all things pest. We want to remind our audience to join in on the revolution. That's right, join in on the conversation, be part of the society. Pest Geek Podcast Listeners Group on Facebook. And we're on YouTube. We're on the web, pestgeekpodcast.com. Check out there the notes, everything that we put into the podcast. They're all on there. And here is Stephen Van Tassel with today's topic.
Thanks, Frank. Stephen Van Tassel here, wildlife control consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife. Wanted to talk today about key facts in the biology of gray squirrels. So this is continuing on some of the suggested topics that was given to me on the Facebook page, Pest Geek Podcast Facebook page. So if you're not signing up, please do. Love to get some feedback, and of course you can always provide feedback to me at my email at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. That's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. So let's get started. A little about some of the key facts in the biology of gray squirrels. Now we're really meaning here about the eastern gray squirrel. So most of us just call them gray squirrels. They are a very common species, basically have a range of about the eastern half of the United States. They are found in some other locations, but it's primarily the eastern half. So if you're looking at the Mississippi and some portions of the Missouri River east, and pretty much about covers where the eastern gray squirrel resides. And so obviously they're trees. They do pretty well in urbanized environments, provided there's enough trees available, particularly those that produce mast, which is just sort of a fancy word for acorns and seed-bearing type trees. So what's their scientific name? Well, their scientific name is Sciuris carolinensis. Sciuris, S-C-I-U-R-U-S, Sciuris carolinensis, like the Carolinas, Carolinensis, and that is their scientific name. Again, we talked about before about the importance of scientific names. Not that you're going to try to impress your clients, but that when you're trying to do some research on gray squirrels, that you actually use the scientific name so you can find the literature that's going to provide you some of that technical information. So where does that word come from? Where does the scientific name come from? Well, Sciuris actually derives from a Greek word meaning skia, which means shadow or shade, and ura, which means tail. So a shade tail, which certainly makes sense because these squirrels have a long tail and they hold it over their head to protect them from rain and when they're cold. And it's a beautiful way for them to try to protect themselves, sort of like carrying a portable umbrella. And then carolinensis refers to the colony of the Carolina. I'm not sure if that refers to the state of Carolina or whether it was just the initial colony where they were found. I don't know. The article didn't mention that. So what about their size? How big do these animals get? Well, the key issue here is understand that as animals, as a general rule, animals as they go higher on latitude, if they're found in higher latitudes, latitudes go east and west. The equator would be a latitude. But as you go farther toward the north, animals tend to get larger. So as animals get closer to the poles, the animals tend to get larger. So if you have a gray squirrel in Massachusetts, generally speaking, that gray squirrel will be larger than a gray squirrel found in, let's say, Georgia. And there's some reasons for this. The reason is larger animals can tolerate cold better, and so areas with colder temperatures need to have larger mass, because if they have smaller mass, then it's very hard for them to maintain the energy needs necessary for them to maintain heat, the body warmth. So, that being said, understand that these principles, when we talk about their size, you have to understand that animals on the northern end of their range are going to be larger than those in the southern end of the range. So, you as a wildlife control operator need to know that. So, their tail length, their body length, let me repeat that again. So, I'm screwing myself up here, I'm sorry. Total length always includes the body and the tail. So the total length of gray squirrels is 15 to 21 inches. However, if we just measure the tail on its own, the tail is anywhere from 6 to 10 inches. As a general rule of thumb, the tail is about as long as the body. Not quite, because these measurements would be done at the tip of the bone. But when we look at it in terms of the hair, remember, the hair would add extra length onto that tail. So as a general rule, when we look at it just casually, the tail will be about as long as the body, but we're counting the hair in that as well. But when a biologist measures, they're measuring to the tip of the bone. How much do they weigh? Well, anywhere from 10.5 to 25 ounces. So, we're talking about almost 2 pounds, 32 ounces is 2 pounds. So 25 ounces would be a monster squirrel. But 10.5, so a little under a pound, 2/3 of a pound to about 2.5 pounds is where 1.5 pounds. So 2/3 of a pound to 1.5 pounds is about what you're getting for a gray squirrel. Now, why does that matter? Why do we care? It's like, Stephen, why are you giving me this information? Well, if you know that a client's complaining about noise above their drop ceiling and they have the spongy insulation style drop ceiling, that is not the stiff version, but the insulation version, which is very easily bendable, then you have to ask the question, would a 1.5 pound squirrel not fall through that? So is the person really hearing a squirrel, or is the person hearing a mouse? Or maybe a flying squirrel, depending where you live. So these are the types of questions that you want to ask yourself, and that is, so you start understanding the importance of size and weight and noise, because as a general rule, clients, the way it's been phrased to me, and I think it really is apropos, and that is, mice sound like squirrels, squirrels sound like raccoons, raccoons sound like elephants. That is, your client tends to oversize what they're hearing. And so, and as we all know, women always hear things sooner than a man, because a man is preconditioned to ignore noise because he knows if there's noise, he has to do work. So yes, I know I'm probably violated a bunch of PC rules there, but you will find in your work, trust the women that you're listening to, because they tend to hear at a higher range as well. So they're much more sensitive to sound than most men. But there's also a sociological benefit. It's that men, as soon as the man acknowledges that there's a noise, he's got to do something about it. So the longer he ignores it, the more likely he doesn't have to push off. He can push off that work. All right. So let's talk about reproduction. What is a reproduction? So females will mate with multiple males. Males will travel some significant distances, no shock here, to find a female to mate with. One researcher noted that a male can travel up to 546 yards. Now, when you think about the size of a squirrel, that is a long, long way for a squirrel to go to mate with a female. So it's 5.5 football fields. That's over a quarter of a mile. It's a long ways for a squirrel to be moving, And remember, he's got to avoid predators at the same time with this, so that's amazing. How many young does the female have? Well, the average litter size is going to be 2 to 3. The maximum litter size is going to be 8. So it is possible that your female, if she's mature enough and well-fed enough, she could have up to 8 young. So the reproductive rate can be quite substantial if conditions are appropriate in your particular area. The young are born naked and blind. They're called pinkies among the industry because when they're born, they're naked, they have no hair, and they're pink. And their eyes have not opened, but they will scream. Oh my gosh. And when they get disturbed, they can scream pretty loud. And it's amazing how much volume comes out of that small creature there. Eyes open in anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks. So if you know that the eyes have not opened, if you're upon a nest and you see pinkies and the eyes have not opened, then, well, you know she only dropped those young within 3 weeks ago. Probably less than that. But it could be up to 5 weeks or 6 weeks before those eyes open. The young are weaned, that is, they stop nursing anywhere from 7 to 10 weeks. So when they're weaned, they're going to be hungry, they're going to be coming out and investigating. So if you have a situation where you're not able to get to the nest and find the young, if you trap a female that's nursing, and you would know that by the enlarged nipples, oftentimes the nipples will turn black if she's been nursing for any length of time, then you would have to say to the client, well, I need the baby, let the mother go, and wait 7 to 10 weeks if that's possible. Otherwise, you may be able to take the mother, and yes, the young will ultimately die if they're not mature enough to be able to move around. These are some of the tough questions and issues that we have to deal with. So when you're touting yourself as a quote-unquote humane wildlife control operator, we've talked about this before, what exactly does that mean? So are you going to violate your humane practices just because your client wants the job over with and doesn't care that the young starve or die of exposure? Is that a humane company? Are you really humane, or can you provide humane services? See how, if you want to be accurate in your advertising, see how that makes a difference. Home range. Home range is the area where squirrels are living. And how big is that? Well, it can vary anywhere from 1 acre to 50. So 50 acres is a pretty big area, but it could be as small as 1 acre. It kind of depends on the available food sources and harborage. Most cases, the home range is going to be less than 8 acres. So if you're looking for a rule of thumb, so remember, in urban areas, you have some people with some bird feeders, and they keep them well supplied, then, that maybe it's only going to need 1 acre. Plenty of food. Gray squirrels will defend a small portion of their territory. They're not really territorial in the sense that they become incredibly aggressive against other gray squirrels to defend their territory. There are situations where when a female is beginning to make her nest, that she will defend a very small area to keep other squirrels away. But as a general rule, they're pretty tolerant of each other. And that area in a home range is called a core area. So sometimes a gray squirrel will defend a very core area. It's sort of like, the property your house is on, you may become very sensitive on, but just seeing someone drive on your street, you don't care, right? What kind of sounds do gray squirrels make? Well, they can make 4 sounds that signify an alarm. So I'm not going to talk about other noises. We're talking here about an alarm, where they're trying to give a warning to others. And that would be a buzz, a cuck, a K-U-K, a moan, or a quah. So those are 4, and so you might want to listen to them when you're doing your work. Some people in the business like to carry animal calls to see if they can, if they're doing an inspection, see if they can get a squirrel to react to it, or a raccoon. They'll use other calls for other animals as well. I never got into that very much. I didn't need to per se, but I do think in some parts of the country it could be quite helpful. It's something that you may want to try. What do they feed on? Well, everyone knows they love nuts, right? Like squirrels love acorns. Well, the research shows they eat a variety of plants, and believe it or not, they will eat up to 14 different animal items. So we've talked about this before, and that is just because an animal is a vegetarian doesn't mean they're pure vegetarian. And many times that we're finding as we learn more about animals is that they will stray from these old categories that we used to have for them. And one of those categories would be vegetarian meat eater. Well, we find that the vegetarians aren't quite as vegetarian as they will dabble in some protein areas. Gray squirrels, unlike red squirrels, are what's called scatter cachers. Now, caching is where an animal is storing food for the future, just like you have a cupboard of food in your house, most likely. Well, animals do the same thing. You have food available in case something happens and you can't get to the store. Well, squirrels harvest acorns and seeds when they're plentiful and store them so they can find them at times when they are not plentiful. Gray squirrels scatter cache it, which means they take a little bit of those seeds and put a little bit in one spot and a little bit in another spot and a little bit in another spot. Red squirrels, by contrast, pile. They're a hoard cacher, so they will create this large mass of pine cones, for instance, and just pile it in one spot. I removed the one once, and it filled half of a 32-gallon trash bag. It was amazing. Just all piled up. They were in the gutter, in fact, and I was just pulling all this stuff out. So the reason why gray squirrels will scatter cache, and that is if a neighboring squirrel finds their cache, all they're getting is one acorn. And they don't lose everything. So by scatter caching, they distribute the risk. But if they hoard cached, then if a squirrel found their hoard, they would lose everything. Okay, that's kind of the idea. There's sort of a rationale to it. But they're scatter cachers. Now, how deep will a squirrel bury a nut in the ground? And that's typically up to 1 inch. So when they're out there in the fall taking acorns and putting them into the ground, they will bury them down to about 1 inch. And they tend to select acorns based on the amount of tannic acid in them. Now, tannic acid is part of an acid that forms naturally in these acorns, and they tend to choose the ones that have a higher level of tannic acid, so they will be preserved longer. The ones with lower tannic acid, they'll tend to just eat right away. If you want to read more about this, I've only taken some of the highlights, some elements that I thought would be the most relevant for those of you in business. But if some of you want to get a little geeky and go even deeper into some things, you can read the article by John L. Koprowski. That's Koprowski. And the title of his article is Sciuris carolinensis. It came out in the journal known as Mammalian Species 480, December 2nd, pages 1 through 9. So he'll have a lot of other information for you if you really want to get into some bizarre things. And again, what this article did, what this series, the Mammalian Species series does, is they find a well-known researcher who specialized in that particular genus of animals, and they ask him or her to go through the scientific literature and sort of provide a synopsis, gather all that data and put it into one place. All that technical data on understanding what that species is all about. And that's why they call it Sciuris carolinensis. And so it's quite an honor to be asked to do one of these articles because it's quite important and it simplifies the process, just takes information from a whole host of journal articles and puts it all in one place on the biology and life history of that particular animal. Well, I hope you find that helpful. Again, if you have ideas for other topics that you want me to cover, please drop me a line. Contribute. It would help me enormous. Otherwise, I'm just going to talk about what interests me. And again, my name is Stephen Van Tassel, Wildlife Control Consultant.
We hope you have enjoyed this edition of the Pest Geek Podcast. Until next time, have a pestacular day.
Thank you for listening to the Pest Geek Podcast. If you have enjoyed the Pest Geek Podcast, please give us a rating, write a review, or subscribe to the channel. You can join the Pest Geek Society by visiting pestgeekpodcast.com. Thank you for listening. See you next time.